What were the beginnings of representation in the English Parliament? When were individuals first summoned to the King's Parliaments to speak for their county or borough? What share did these representatives have in events that transpired at Parliament or in the powers or functions that were exercised there? For many years, these were the dominant questions about the history of the English Parliament, dominant nearly to the degree that inquiry into its origins might be identified with inquiry into the origins of representation in England. The pioneering work of Bishop Stubbs placed the rise of a third estate at the center of England's constitutional history, and Stubbs maintained that the key developments took place very early in Parliament's history in the 13th century under Henry III and Edward I. In the introduction to Stubbs's collection of royal writs and charters, which served as a standard textbook for generations of English students, Stubbs opined that it was because Edward, quote, loved his people that he, quote, admits them to a large share in the process of government, providing in his parliaments for, and this is Stubbs's language, the representation of all classes of freemen regularly summoned. Stubbs's constitutional history labeled Edward's Parliament of 1295 the model parliament for firmly establishing the representative principle as a fundamental characteristic of the English Constitution. Representation in early English parliaments is the subject of this chapter. The matter has remained at the center of parliamentary studies, even as historians have retreated from Stubbs's framing and from some of his assertions about institutional development in England. Comparative studies of early parliaments in Spain, Italy, and France have generally treated the appearance of representatives as the primary development to be explained. It was at the center as well of early scholarship on Anglo-American constitutional history. Naturally, scholars who rejected Stubbs's teaching about Edward's reasons for summoning representatives also remained focused on the practice. But even the school that sought to reframe early English parliaments primarily as courts of law retained a concern with representation, if only to demonstrate Maitland's dictum that, quote, this is Maitland's language, a session of the King's Council is the core and essence of every parliamentum, rather than a gathering of elected knights and burgesses. Though forcefully stated, the case was never quite made, and among the most recent generation, one encounters provocative expressions of support for Stubbs. Quote, whatever the rights and wrongs of Stubbs's model, one leading scholar has written, he was unquestionably right to see Parliament in general and the Commons in particular as creatures of the 13th century. That's David Carpenter. In this book, I have tried to avoid taking a position on what the core and essence was of early English parliaments, whether it be a political assembly of great men or a high court of justice. Instead, my focus has been on tracing the development of certain social attitudes about appropriate conduct in royal councils. The attitudes in which I am most interested were the source of social norms that we today regard as characteristic of legislative bodies. So in chapter 2, that's the chapter before the one I'm reading to you now, I trace the emergence in early 13th century of robust deliberations in English royal councils, which acquired around the same time a new name better fitting this distinctive type of speech, parliament. The development of deliberative politics in Parliament provided a means for managing the exercise of power and avoiding familiar patterns of destructive violence. Contemporaries took notice and began to record the exchanges in detail. As medievalist Thomas Bisson has explained, quote, everyone cares and cared about power, its excesses, distribution, and restraints. Focusing on power may reduce the danger of anachronism, a focus on representation, which in truth reflects the supremacy of the modern House of Commons. But that approach also leaves it puzzling why representatives should have been summoned to early parliaments at all. Why should local representatives be added to a deliberative council of great men? It is not at all obvious that there should be anything like a representative parliament, that those two features belong together in some single large assembly. In part 1 of this book, I emphasize the role of 12th century cathedral schools in transmitting a special deliberative culture through the teaching of logic and theology. Students brought this culture to England and sought to incorporate their learning into administrative work as clerks in royal, episcopal, and seigneurial households. Some great men themselves became familiar with robust deliberative politics in the city of London, whose rulers engaged in public debate before large assemblies at the Guildhall, and whose cathedral of St. Paul's was staffed by learned clerks who spoke on the state of the realm before crowds at the church. Do we have evidence to show local representatives in the 13th century also had this education or this political experience? The core argument of this chapter is that representatives were first summoned to early English parliaments because they became relevant to parliamentary politics. The factions operating at court under Henry III drew county knights into parliament, recruiting them as valuable allies in political struggles that were happening at the center. To make sense of their presence at the center, baronial leaders began to speak and write of a, quote, community of the realm, a communitas or universitas, that included others besides the barons themselves. The effect was to postulate a national political community much broader than the one which in 1215 had forced King John to concede Magna Carta on grounds that he had failed to observe liberties granted the barons in various ancient charters. By 1250, it was county knights who were claiming liberties, now under Magna Carta, in an effort to substantiate their own grievances about local government and the king's sheriffs. In the 1260s, the Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort, seized upon local reform to bolster his faction against the favorites and siblings of King Henry III. And county knights found him an attractive leader because Montfort was an exemplary knight from an illustrious family line. Now, these calculations could not have borne fruit without an underlying set of social attitudes and practices that shaped the behavior of the aristocracy, the knights, and the king. Before we can tell the story of the Revolution of 1258 and the parliaments that followed, we need to familiarize ourselves with these attitudes and practices. They have very disparate sources. Some were the product of long-standing features of English government and society, but others were quite new and really came from outside England entirely. The variety of these ingredients is responsible for the great variety of historical writing about the development of representation in Parliament and for the dueling character of its historiography. So in the next several sections, I'm going to introduce 4 such ingredients, and we'll probably only have time to get to 3. 1, the long-standing administrative uses of representation. That is, the selection of individuals to stand for communities in various operations of local and royal government. That's the bit you're going to be quite familiar with. 2, a set of social changes, namely the increased independence and status of the county knights who performed much of this administrative work. 3, the development of a notion of consent in the councils of the church deriving from various elements in canon law. And finally, 4th, and this is the part I don't think we'll reach today, the growth of what I call an ideology of reform, which knit together aristocrats, bishops, and the new mendicant orders of the Dominican and Franciscan friars, in which instilled in them a sense of moral compulsion, fueling the demands of Earl Simon's faction. An understanding of these attitudes and practices will make it possible to explain why Simon thought to involve representative knights in what were essentially aristocratic disputes about patronage and money, what role he expected representatives to play, and how knights were soon able to claim for themselves a more substantial set of functions in parliaments. All right, 1, administrative uses of representation. The kings of England had long made use of local representatives. The notion that men could stand for their ville, usually a village, that is a cluster of houses and adjacent fields, or their hundred, a group of neighboring villes, must have been an old one, as Maitland observed, pointing to language in the Legis Henrici Primi, an early 12th century text. The notion was old, but it was not dead, and nearly 100 years after the Legis, it still shows new growth. In an earlier chapter, I considered chartered boroughs, which were rapidly increasing at this time, in which the mayor or alderman might stand for the burgesses in their court. The county, too, now exhibits a solidarity not unlike smaller communities. It has representatives in the county court, which is treated as the, quote, full county for purposes of business before the king's justices. Like boroughs, counties sought to record their customs and privileges in charters of liberties. From this time, kings are constantly adjusting and adapting what must have been a familiar form of social order. If they need specific types of men to represent the community, they say who it is they need. The lawful or law-worthy, legalis, man features centrally in our sources in this regard. To resolve disputes over rights to property, Henry II required the presence of 12 law-worthy knights from the county and the neighborhood where the property lay, who best know the truth of the matter. To determine whether someone had been wrongfully dispossessed, the sheriff was to summon 12, quote, free and law-worthy men from the neighborhood. On visitations by the justices, 12 of the more law-worthy men from each 100 and 4 from each vill were to say under oath who was suspected of robbery and so on. This was the jury of presentment, in essence, an early form of grand jury. As a jury, the law-worthy men stood for their community, for it was the community that alleged the crime, and sometime later it was the community who gave its verdict. Being law-worthy must have captured whatever it was that made a person acceptable to king and community in this representative role. We cannot be certain, but perhaps it entailed possessing enough property, social status, and knowledge to speak credibly under oath. Law-worthy men also played their part to royal changes in taxation. Henry II employed them in the so-called Saladin tithe of 1188, a crusading levy, often described as an early national tax, where he asked them to swear to the true value of property held by tax evaders. A 1220 carucage, a kind of tax on arable land, was to be collected by the sheriff, along with, quote, 2 of the more law-worthy knights of the county, chosen elegantur for that purpose by the will and counsel of all the county in the county court. Elegantur is usually translated elected, but we should not imagine something like an open ballot. Since the chancery writ required the sheriff to see that the knights selected were, quote, better informed, willing, and capable of exerting themselves in this business to our advantage, not just anyone would have been an acceptable candidate. Sometimes the king summons law-worthy men to his court to handle matters of justice or taxation, rather than dispatching his commissioners to them. So when someone has complained to the king about injustice suffered in the county court, it is law-worthy knights from the county who must bear the record to the royal justices, which is to say, they must travel to meet the justices and tell them what has transpired, perhaps with an aid of an enrolled writing. In such a case, we learn the knights speak for the county pro comitatu, and if their account is challenged, they must prove the accuracy of the county record at the risk of being fined or even worse. Sometimes the king summons several parties at the same time. Particularly difficult cases or cases in which the king takes a special interest might all be adjourned to a place where the relevant personnel will be near at hand. In the close rolls of Henry III's chancery about mid-century, we find copies of writs ordering that a matter be stayed and brought before the council or the exchequer on a certain date, usually 2 weeks after a major Christian feast like Hilary, Easter, or Michaelmas. This was a special session that would coincide with Parliament. Representatives were summoned to the center for other reasons as well. The king saw use for all sorts of men, and he tells us who he needs at his council, his parliament, or his court. In 1207, John summons the minters, examiners of money, and custodians of the die from 16 different boroughs to come to Westminster to hear his precept on coinage. Specifically requested were men who, quote, knew how to give counsel about coining money. So it seems he wanted advice about the coinage or how best to carry out his policy. A famous writ of 1213, also from John, summoned discreet or wise, discretos, knights from every county to a council. Again, we cannot be certain what discreet meant, though it seems to have differed from lawworthy, at least in part, since a writ of 1212 required both qualifications. Another pair of well-known writs from 1226 and 1227 summoned 4 of the more lawworthy and discreet knights on behalf of each county to a council of Henry III. There, they were to explain their allegations that sheriffs had ignored liberties guaranteed by Magna Carta, suggesting an interpretation of discretos along the lines of discerning and implying some degree of learning as well as factual knowledge. Lawworthy knights, lawworthy men, discreet knights, better burgesses. By the 1230s, representatives engaged in the business of royal government must have been a familiar sight at the king's councils. This may account for why the presence went largely unnoticed by chroniclers, a matter that has long puzzled historians. But it is also likely that representatives went unnoted because they were largely quiet. As best we can tell, representatives sat further from the king at Parliament than did the barons, as charter witness lists suggest a seating arrangement organized by social order and personal status or dignitas. They would not have spoken first, and they could not have easily intervened in an ongoing debate between great men. None of this implies that the powers of local representatives were merely formal or transactional. A considerable discretion was often involved, as the evidence above makes clear. So the writs directing the selection of lawworthy men to assess taxes also contained lengthy schedules of exempted forms of property, which implies a judgment about what to count in calculating the tax bill. In some cases, assessors were asked to decide who should pay at all, as the poor were explicitly relieved of any obligation, and others were asked to give only according to their ability. Discretion and judgment were also required of representatives summoned to the center. The mentors summoned by King John in 1207 were to hear the king's precept on coinage, but also to give him advice on the matter. The lawworthy knights and discreet knights summoned from each county in 1227 were asked to show or explain ad ostendendum their grievances against the county sheriffs concerning the holding of county and hundred courts. We don't have any record of what they said, but a widely shared grievance expressed in a public assembly surely had political overtones. On other occasions, representatives were summoned to speak ad loquendum with the king and his council, or perhaps to tell them about certain matters. However, in contrast, royal writs summoning great men asked them to treat ad tractandum with the king, an expression long used to describe princely negotiations, in which we should probably distinguish from speak. Notably, the first summons to ask representatives to treat on regnal affairs came from Simon of Montfort in 1264 and 1265. Representation is a complex concept. Helen Cam listed 7 practices in English government to which the term might reasonably be applied, though they involve representation in different senses. Among those she identified were suitors attending the county court and lawworthy knights bearing its record to royal justices, examples that we just considered. So if by representative we mean a person who acts for a group, as these people did, then representatives were early at work in administering the king's government. Yet these were not representatives in another sense, more robust and probably more familiar. This is the representative elected in a district who advocates for their constituents by casting votes in the legislature. We have little evidence that the lawworthy knights selected in the county courts understood themselves to have constituents in this sense, with the possible exception of 1227, where the circumstances imply a concern with shrieval abuses. More commonly, advocacy ran in the opposite direction. Representatives would be asked to persuade their communities of the wisdom of a royal policy. Kings used representatives to induce voluntary compliance. Neither was there a widespread sense that a representative might bind his community by consenting to whatever was put before him at a parliament. His powers were specific, not general, its parameters laid out in a royal writ. And though representatives might be collected, that is, summoned to the center at the same time, there is little evidence they acted collectively. That is, that they thought of themselves collectively, as had the barons of Magna Carta, and as would the knights of the Shire, who formed themselves into a commons in the Parliament of Edward III. Still missing is a fellow feeling and a sense of shared life that animates the political representative. 2, independence in the formation of a knightly class. To understand how county knights became parliamentary representatives in this more robust sense will require us to consider social changes occurring in the early 13th century. It was in this period that knights became increasingly independent from lords. Here, independence refers to autonomy, the power to govern oneself. It was a fundamental idea in English society and law. The 13th century legal treatise, known as Bracton, classified each person according to whether he was in his own potestas or another's, or a situation is doubtful. Bracton does not identify knights as dependent in this passage, but uses of the Latin term miles and milites, which referred to knights, traditionally carried this connotation. Peter Koss, a leading scholar of English knighthood, has argued the most frequent historical use of miles was to, and this is Koss's language, indicate dependence upon another. A man is the knight of a lord. This dependence had political ramifications. In earlier conflicts, such as the rebellion preceding the 1215 Magna Carta, which I discussed in an earlier chapter, rebel barons could generally count on support from their knights. Greater independence meant greater numbers of knights were open to other alliances, and this openness increased their political power as a class. We might even say it made them a political class, rather than simply a military force. This was a significant change for English knights. The earliest English knights seem to have been a mixed lot. An account of William the Conqueror's first days as England's king in 1066 records his admonitions first to his magnates, then to knights of middling rank, that's the language, and common soldiers. Later chronicles draw similar distinctions, for example, between farmer knights, that's agrarios milites, and noble knights. In litigation before the king's justices concerning rights to a marshland, the abbot of Crowland was supported by 2 very modest knights because others were too intimidated to oppose the powerful parties on the other side. The Historia Novella, probably written around the middle of the 12th century, includes a particularly memorable episode in which a county knight cut his long hair after dreaming he had been strangled with it. The example soon spread throughout England, and, quote, nearly all the knights cut their hair, to the great approval of our monkish author, William of Malmesbury. But after a year, those knights, this is William's language, who regard themselves as courtiers, began to wear their hair long again, some so desperate as to use a wig. The evidence then points to important social distinctions among early English knights. What these knights shared were techniques for making war, attitudes that grew out of war making, and a distinction that flowed from the use of arms in the service of a lord. But before the 13th century, English knights were not a social class. Knights included great lords, famous warriors hired to fight in the lord's contingent, and the bands of followers who were trained in varying degrees in the profession of arms. Many of these men did not hold a knight's fee, the estate of land granted in exchange for military service and theoretically the basis of feudalism. Instead, they might be household knights, boarded and paid to garrison a castle or to form the permanent nucleus of an expandable fighting force. They might be retained by wages to attend closely to the lord's interests, acquiring a special degree of intimacy and responsibility as his household bachelors. It is unsurprising then to encounter a distinction between, quote, active, strenuous knights, that's the term that's used most, strenuous, and merely belted knights in the dialogue of the Exchequer, the royal financial manual of the late 12th century. It recommended against seizing the property of an insolvent active knight who, quote, keeps his armor bright and loves to use it. So he might be employed on the business of the king and realm, fully equipped with arms and horses. In contrast, the insolvent belted knight should be left with only a horse, lest he be made to suffer the indignity of travel by foot. These are familiar sources, and what they show is that contemporaries perceive distinctions between different kinds of knights, not just between individual knights or the lords that those knights served. Writers expressed annoyance at one kind of knight or another, as in the case of William of Malmesbury, who disapproved of long-haired, feminine courtier knights. Others were annoyed at the failure to acknowledge distinctions they thought vital. Richard de Lucy, Henry II's justiciar, rebuffed a litigant who challenged the authenticity of a charter deed because it lacked a seal, remarking, and this is Richard's language, in old days it was not the custom for every knightling, militulum, every knightling to have a seal, which befits only kings and great men. Richard himself was a knight of some renown, but he was also a great royal officer, and he was duly sensitive to inappropriate aspirations. In what has been called an age of deference, knighthood bridged classes, inviting conduct that could muddy social distinctions and trigger disapproval or disdain. Beginning with Georges Duby, a leading medievalist of the mid-20th century, historians have argued that lords reacted over the long run by embracing chivalry, a knightly ethos whose symbols and rituals like knighting ceremonies and heraldry and tournaments worked to exclude or subordinate knightlings and other lower class servants. By internalizing the norms of chivalry and closely regulating their expression, aristocrats would form themselves into a graded nobility. Yet, other forces tended in the opposite direction. Those with fewer lands and revenues embraced forms of service that, while nominally subordinating them to greater men, had the effect of increasing their independence. The most important of these was the administration of manorial estates. The manor was a landed agricultural estate, including a lord's home, their fields called domain land, fields leased to tenants, and a village or villages where tenants resided. Beginning in the late 12th century, lords began to reacquire leased lands and to bring them under direct production, increasing their domain. For many years, scholars believed this was a response to price inflation, which had reduced the real value of an income based on fixed rents, though the evidence for inflation is now disputed. Alternatively, it may have been an effort by enterprising lords to capture some of the spoils of increased commercial activity. To operate domain at profit required a staff of skilled managers, particularly for great lords who were peripatetic and absent from their manors for lengthy periods of time. An estate's steward was retained to look after the lord's interests, assisted by local bailiffs and reeves. The office of steward, bailiff, and reeve are described in a family of didactic texts dating from about the middle of the 13th century, which also set out methods for surveying a manor, for taking account of its income and expenses, for auditing those accounts, husbanding its resources, and increasing its yield. Many men retained for this sort of service were knights. For example, Paulin Piper was a royal steward charged with overseeing the manor Odiham during the absence of its lord, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, the king's brother-in-law. Until his death in 1251, Piper, himself a wealthy lord of lands, was described as a learned knight or knightly clerk. So here then is another kind of knight, the miles literatus, whose administrative service resembles that of a clerk. Today we know about a number of these men, thanks to the painstaking work of historians who have reconstructed their careers using the legal records and charters that exist in significant numbers beginning about mid-century. One well-known case is Robert Carpenter of Harrislade, who was first identified by Maitland. Robert was a free tenant of William de Lisle of Wooton and bailiff on his manor at Shorewell in the very southeast of the Isle of Wight. We do not know whether Robert was knighted, but his holdings and activity place him among the knightly administrative class. His family certainly had pretensions to advancement. In later days, Robert, or perhaps his son, went through his papers to scratch out Carpenter and insert a more prestigious place-based surname to Harrislade. In addition to managing his lord's manor at Shorewell, for which he prepared accounts, Robert assisted William in preparing accounts for the vacant bishopric of Winchester, of which William had been made guardian. As an aide, Robert compiled a dossier of administrative and legal texts, such as accounting forms for Shorewell, and including, remarkably, instructions on how to cook the books, that is, how to cheat there. Also in his dossier were the articles of a royal heir, essentially an interrogatory administered by traveling royal justices, which visited Hampshire County in 1256, in which Robert attended as both a juror and a litigant, as well as materials from about half a dozen other Hampshire heirs. Robert inserted a collection of writs from a central royal court called the Bench, later known as the Court of Common Pleas, concerning appeals involving the Shorewell Manor. At the front of his dossier, Robert added an updated edition of Glanville, the 12th century legal treatise describing rules for obtaining and prosecuting various royal writs. Maitland thought the revisions, the updates, so full of, and this is Maitland's language, mistakes of that stupid kind, as to suggest the work of a copyist. Though the inclusion of materials specifically related to Shorewell and the Hampshire heirs made this unlikely, instead Maitland concluded we were probably faced with the author who was neither much of a Latinist nor much of a lawyer. Another group of knightly administrators, somewhat more elevated than men like Robert, are the famous Bouzones mentioned in Bracton. Bouzone was apparently a popular term for leading man of the county. Because the consent of these big shots tended to settle matters for other suitors at court, Bracton advised visiting royal justices to meet with them before opening the heir in private to discuss the jurors' obligations. That their meeting is private and a discussion, tractatum, suggests that there is some persuasion going on. From another text, an early 13th century case report, we learn of Bouzones bearing the record of the county to the king's justices, a practice that we discussed a little earlier. In this instance, the Bouzones have rather unwisely attempted to falsify the record, making various amendments to its role, perhaps in an effort to insulate their doings in the county court. The ruse is discovered and the men are imprisoned. It was an unfortunate turn in what were largely successful administrative careers. Walter de Eyre was a royal bailiff, enjoying various profitable privileges under grants from King John. Philip de Beaumont held lands in Gloucestershire, Somerset, and Dorset, served as a champion for Walter de Cantilupe, a great baron and royal official. Elias Cockerell was also a knight with estates in several counties, connections at John's court. And William de Parco was knight to John himself, who, after serving in various roles in Gloucestershire County and royal courts, entered the land market using money from Jewish lenders. Manorial administration made men useful to the king and to themselves, not just to their lords. We cannot assume a bailiff will promote his lord's interests, as Robert Carpenter's tips for cooking the books show. Margaret Labarge, author of a monograph on the household of Eleanor, Countess of Leicester and wife to Simon de Montfort, suggested that this sort of fraud was common. And indeed, a concern with it appears throughout didactic texts on household administration in that period. Stewards and bailiffs also use their skills for royal administration. There they might be asked to use what they know of their lord's estate to facilitate the collection of taxes. The mechanisms for collecting taxes laid out in royal writs from the 1230s and 40s surveyed above would not have been viable if the knights selected had not known how to praise taxable property. And some must have first learned to do this while in the service of a lord, since that was their regular employ. It was in seigneurial service, too, that many learned how to request royal writs and how to plead cases in royal court, as Robert Carpenter's dossiers show. Although they might be poor Latinists, knights are not afraid to make use of the courts for their own ends. Sometimes their interests are opposed to their lords, as in the case of a knight retained under contract by multiple lords who suddenly finds his obligations to them in conflict. A suit for breach of contract was not a matter for the king's courts, according to Glanville. Nevertheless, by the 13th century, the suits can be found there. In another case, a bailiff seems to have engineered what modern lawyers would call a strike suit against a local abbot as leverage to acquire livery and wages from him. In other cases, in contrast, a knight's interests align with his lord's, as in complaints of unlawful exactions or dispossessions by the king's sheriffs. Legal historians have also sought to emphasize knights' use of royal courts to protect their interests in land. Unlawful dispossession could, of course, be fought using the writ of novel to season. Applied to the lord who had dispossessed his own man, the effect was to prevent that lord from conclusively determining in their own court who should be a tenant. By mid-century, a lord's dispossession could be challenged even without such a writ. Buoyed by the remedies available before royal justices to vindicate possession, ownership, and transfer of land, knights became eager participants in the land market, both as sellers and as buyers. Over time, the effect was to homogenize knights as a locally influential, administratively active land-holding class. As Alan Harding has pithed it, quote, this is Harding's language, the range of landholders, later called the gentry, are best characterized as the people who are able to use the procedures of the common law to protect, develop, and exploit family lands. It is this combination of administrative expertise, local influence and status, and education, habitual recourse to royal court, and economic power that constitutes the increased independence of 13th century English knights. Okay, 3. Consent in the councils of the church. Over the same period, other forces are at work on the council itself. To understand what knights, these new independent knights, might be summoned to do at a parliament requires that we consider these forces and the institutional changes they brought about. The central idea here is consent. The knights soon summoned to parliament would be asked to approve taxes and reforms affecting their constituents. While in many circumstances this entailed some negotiation and discussion, it was generally less active and confrontational than the Council of Magnates that was studied in an earlier chapter. In this context, consent and council were different things. Consent, in this sense, was a product of developments in the councils of the church. The importance of the church to the development of parliament has been a theme throughout this book. In chapter 1, I examined an episcopal council held at Winchester in the early 12th century, attended by clergy, lay lords, and representatives of the king, which stood as evidence of the influence of school methods on councils. Princes and prelates continued to summon each other to great councils into the 13th century, but alongside these episodic encounters, there grew up a set of more robust, ongoing connections and relationships. As Sir Maurice Powys described this state of affairs in his classic study of King Henry III, quote, kings, archbishops, bishops, clergy, and people did not stand outside, but inside the great organism of the church, which is to say they were all expected to cooperate in its life. Indeed, Henry faced this expectation more than most. In May 1213, during a moment of acute political crisis, Henry's father, John, had surrendered England as a fief to Pope Innocent III. Included in John's grant was an annual tribute of 1,000 marks in lieu of service to his new lord, the Pope, an obligation one suspects whose costs John reckoned only in the near term, but which popes continued to demand from England for over 100 years. Thus, when John died suddenly in 1216 and a regency was installed to govern for the child King Henry, the Pope and his agents played a major role. A series of papal legates, Galla and Pandulf, served as head of England's government during the next 5 years. Even afterward, indeed throughout the reign, one can find startling confusions of royal and ecclesiastical authority. For example, the Pope's effort to tax the English magnates, and Henry to claim a share of the religious possessions of beneficed clergy. The expectations that Galla and Pandulf brought to ruling England must have been influenced by ideas and practices in the governance of the church, which were developing rapidly at the time. At the opening of the century, the church remained relatively decentralized. In the judgment of Brian Tierney, prominent scholar of canon law, it was in essence, and this is Brian's language, a federation of semi-autonomous units, a union of innumerable greater or lesser bodies. For some time, however, canon lawyers had been busy nurturing an idea that the Roman pontiff enjoyed a preeminence in the church. He possessed, they argued, plenitudinem potestatis, a fullness of power, in contrast to the limited jurisdiction of other bishops. And this justified his authority to issue universal laws and to sit as a supreme judge in ecclesiastical disputes. Over the run of cases, the judgments of his papal court nourished forces that tended to oppose themselves to an independently minded bishop. The most important was the chapter of clergy resident in the bishop's cathedral. In an earlier age, these canons had been members of the bishop's household, but now the Pope recognized their exclusive right to elect the bishop, reserving for the Pope himself a power to hear appeals in election disputes. The canons, in turn, asserted a right to meet in a council, also called a chapter, where they might handle matters of diocesan government, even outside the presence of the bishop. One scholar has seen in these various developments the canons forming themselves into something like a cathedral commune, a collective prelacy, akin to the collective seigneury of certain French towns. Of particular importance here is an emerging body of chapter rights related to the management of the church and the disposition of its property. The canon's special concern with these matters had long been recognized. According to Gratian's Decretum, the first great systematic collection of canon law sources, bishops lacked a power to ordain a new priest without the, quote, council of the cathedral chapter. We cannot be certain whether this entailed the chapter's approval or just its advice. In the second half of the 12th century, the pace of appeals to Rome quickened, and the lawyers and teachers working with the decretum and other legal collections became more sophisticated. Chapter rights were refined in a series of published decisions called decretals. The decretals of Pope Gregory IX, compiled by official sanction in 1234 and known to canon lawyers as Liber Extra, clarified that chapters had no right to, quote, dissent to a transaction by the bishop if they had earlier consented, a limitation that implied at least a practice of seeking their consent. Several decades later, in a gloss on another decretal from Liber Extra, the canon lawyer Henry of Susa was more explicit about the scope and basis of chapter rights. If you ask the reason why the consent of the canons is required in the alienation of the property of the church, this can be responded, since it concerns every cleric that the possessions of the church or chapter are not alienated. In discussing these disputes, canon lawyers made use of two bits of Roman law that proved especially fruitful for the growth of representation in the 13th century. The first we can think of as something like a branch of the law of agency, as expressed in various Roman offices like proctor, tutor, or guardian. The proctor, for example, was introduced in Justinian's institutes as an agent for managing litigation. Since the proctor was appointed by the litigant, it now seemed an appropriate template for the bishop, who is said to derive his authority from election by the chapter. Canon lawyers applied this analogy to a range of questions about the relationship between bishop and chapter. Thus, according to some commentators, while the bishop as proctor could answer lawsuits against the cathedral, he lacked any power to settle those suits without a special mandate from the chapter, presumably because settlement might involve giving something up. It was the cathedral chapter that must consent to alienations of church property because, as Henry of Susa explained, preserving what belonged to the church concerns each canon. His reasoning evoked a second piece of Roman law commonly employed by the canonists, the legal maxim, that which concerns all alike ought to be approved by all. This maxim existed in alternate formulations between which there were subtle distinctions, but they nearly all began with the tag, quote, omnes tangit, in reference to a matter that concerned, interested, affected, or touched every member of the group. By the late 12th century, canonists were using the maxim to settle the respective rights of prelates and lower clergy, as well as the proper procedures for hearing disputes involving multiple parties. In the 13th century, the maxim entered a new phase of its career in connection with church councils. Lower clergy cited, quote, omnes tangit in support of their demands for a council, to be summoned to one, to give or withhold consent to policies affecting their income or possessions. We can observe these developments in a series of early 13th century church councils. In April 1213, in preparation for a general council at the Lateran Palace in Rome, Pope Innocent III wrote to bishops asking that their chapters send someone for themselves, since things will be dealt with at the council that pertain specially to chapters. Among these were matters affecting church property, as the final acts or canons of the council reveal. Canon 11, for example, required all chapters of clergy with sufficient means to set aside income to pay a schoolmaster. And Canon 46 addressed the question of whether lay authorities could tax a church. Although it forbade compulsory taxation, churches were permitted freely to contribute property if a bishop, together with his clergy, should foresee so great a need or advantage after consulting with the Pope. Though we do not know if the representatives summoned to this Fourth Lateran Council approved these measures, we don't know anything about them. Their summons certainly did not pass unnoticed. In the years following 1215, clerical chapters began to demand their inclusions at councils. The first of these cases arose the very next year, when the Archbishop of Sens sought to block cathedral chapters within his province from sending proctors to a provincial council. Complaints soon reached the papal court, and in February 1216, Pope Honorius III declared that chapters had a right to send spokesmen to discuss matters that concern the chapters themselves and perhaps other matters as well. This was glossed right away as a supportive, quote, omnes tangit. Very soon, and here's where I'll end, the maxim found its way to England. Henry of Susa himself, who glossed the Honorius's decretal, served as an ambassador and advisor to King Henry in the 1240s. At Oxford, William of Drogheda was studying Roman law and incorporated, quote, omnes tangit in his own commentaries. But even earlier, in the 1220s, we can find the maxim, quote, omnes, being made to bear weight in controversies about Henry's power to tax the English church. The practice was apparently novel. Our most comprehensive study dates the first post-conquest taxation of church property to 1166 under Henry's eponymous grandfather, while afterwards it occurs only episodically and nearly always with the consent of the prelates. Canon 46 of the Fourth Lateran Council, as I just noted, purported to ban lay taxation of the church, but it did allow for voluntary gifts after consultation with the Pope. This proved all the opening Henry would need. Henry treated the caveat as express acknowledgement of the Pope's authority to direct the clergy to make a gift to the king. And what I tell in the rest of the sections, and I'm happy to talk about with you as during questions, is how Henry used this in controversies in 1226 and 1244 over his efforts to tax the property of clergy, lower clergy in England. All right, I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Steilen. That was a fascinating presentation. We'll now take some questions from those present in person and online.
Thank you very much for a detailed and fascinating presentation. Can I ask, Simon de Montfort was, of course, first an opponent and then a rebel. Do you think that he used representation to legitimize his usurpation, or not quite usurpation, but his interference with the constitutional governance?
It gets ahead of the story that I've told here. And that is one of the traditional questions about the appearance of representatives in Simon's parliaments. There are really two schools of thought. There's a pull theory and a push. There's a pull school and a push school. You can think of Simon as being forced to acknowledge the demands of the county if he wanted to be successful in his reform scheme. Or you can think of Simon and his allies as opportunistically making use of the representatives, first from the counties and then from the boroughs, in an effort to create greater leverage before the outbreak of civil war. So I haven't sort of worked all that out, but the position that I described the chapter taking, which I anticipate taking, is one of a poll school that basically, while there was a lot of dissatisfaction in the county, Simon summoned representatives to increase his leverage. That only makes sense if having representatives would increase your leverage. Who cares what they think? So you have to answer the question, why care what they think? Sometimes it's also suggested that Simon summoned them because, almost out of the goodness of his heart, even some of the more recent scholarly literature paint Simon, and I think there is some truth in this, as being independently concerned with reform. I describe this as sort of moral compulsion. So you might think Simon was sort of driven by this kind of maniacal desire to reform the practices of the governance of the realm. And since everyone understood that there were problems in local administration, that required representatives.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Patrick, online, would you like to ask your question?
Absolutely. Greetings from Buffalo, where it is currently snowing, for which I blame Matt. My question is, you do a fantastic job of explaining to us, how the idea of agency or the institution of the proctor allowed one person to speak for another, and how, by this point that was accepted practice. And I really thought it was interesting how canons grew to be accepted as speaking for the whole. What affected the whole, one could speak for the whole. But where I'm interested to hear you go a little bit further is the there's like an intellectual leap between one person speaking for another, as an agent, let's say, and a person speaking for an abstraction like a county or 100. And where did that come from? I mean, when can a person speak for something that you can't touch, or that's an abstraction?
So thank you, Pat. That's a fabulous question. Pat Long is one of my colleagues back home, and it's nice to hear a friendly voice. I would agree. I assume Pat can hear me if I just answer here.
Yes.
There's an important distinction between the power of attorney and political representation. And so the question then would be, given that proctorship in Roman law is something like a power of attorney, a power to manage litigation on someone else's behalf, how could it be the seed or source of, as Pat put it, the power to act for representation, something abstract, a community? And the answer is that the canons of the cathedral recruited proctorship as a means to select someone other than the bishop, because the bishop didn't represent their interests. So proctorship as a legal idea doesn't contain everything that political representation does, but it was used, it was recruited as part of an effort to obtain what was a more effective political representation. And I think the key term there, which I mentioned but didn't really emphasize, is interest. The bishop's interests were not the interests of the canons.
I'm just wondering, how many assemblies were held before the reign of Edward I? We could definitely call parliaments at which representatives were present. I mean, I would suggest not that many.
No, not that many.
So it sounds as if you've got all the ingredients for a representative assembly, the rise of knights, the importance of their function in their performance in a range of administrative functions, the ideas of the church and so on. But you actually don't have that many parliaments until, well, obviously there's the Montfortian, famous Montfortian parliaments, and then of course the transformation of the situation in the 1270s, 1280s under Edward I. So it's slightly paradoxical, the argument there, as I understand it, you're trying to make in that way.
So I think I want to agree with all that. There are certainly representatives in the parliaments of Edward I, but their role, as I take you to have said, is transformed. And this is one of the longstanding questions about Parliament under Edward I, was there a transformation in Parliament from the parliaments of Henry III? Parliaments of Henry III seem to be political, whereas the parliaments of Edward look much more judicial. And so representatives are there, almost presenting petitions. It looks like a judicial process. How could we take that step back when all the sources or ingredients of political representation are present? And the answer is that those sources are necessary causes, but not sufficient causes. The politics of the Montfortian regime and the 1250s and 1260s are related to, obviously, the politics of 1275, but quite distinct from. I mean, I think Edward takes himself to be learning from what happened to his father. He's trying to get out ahead of use of local grievance as a political weapon, to the point where, all these people are brought into Parliament, they're overwhelming political functions of Parliament. So calling administrative uses of representatives, the enhanced social status of knights, canon law notions of consent, calling them sources doesn't mean to say that they were a sufficient cause after we have them. It just means to say they were out there and capable of being used. That's what I want to argue.
Any further questions for me?
I had another question.
Sure, of course.
What about Burgesses? You
Right.
talked a lot about shire rights and the representations of counties, but what about the mercantile interests, the commercial and urban interests? Where do they fit into the story you're telling?
They certainly fit into the story. If we think of the story broadly as the rise of representation, but I already presented enough material. Did you want more? You do have to draw some lines around it. So representatives are first summoned from the boroughs to a parliament in 1265. That's the first time they appear. So it's after. The first parliament at which we think county representatives were elected is 1254. And they're at 1258. So chronologically, they follow in time. There's a whole literature on what borough representatives were doing. Some of it is focused on the economic vitality of cities, boroughs at the time. Nonetheless, I think the conventional view is that they were a distinct second class of representatives for some time. So I think that means that I can tell a story about the introduction of county representatives without trying to involve them yet.
Yeah, comes later. So.
I mean, it comes later, and I think it's a slightly different story in some respects.
Well, if there are no further questions, we might wrap up there. Thank you so much again, Professor Steilen. Wonderful.